Hi, everybody, and welcome to Leeds Museum Club 2. I'm going to be chatting again to Emily Nelson of Leeds Museums and Galleries. And anybody who saw the last one will have seen that we began with the finding of kind of hippo bones, and we'll talk about what it was like before humans, really, in Leeds. And now we're going to begin to move towards modern ideas of Leeds, beginning with Kirkstall Abbey first. So you can still see the other one. We'll pop a link up of that, and then after this, we'll have a little chat with some other people. You should be able to see the Zoom link in the event now. So, Emily, Kirkstall Abbey. Why is Kirkstall Abbey so important?
I mean, because it's great. Firstly, obviously, but yeah. So we left the last episode of our Leeds Museums Club. We left it with the kind of conquest and with the harrying of the north. So I'm actually going to go kind of one earlier than Kirkstall Abbey, back to that point. Right. Anyone who watched this last time might be able to remember that we talked about Beeston and how in the Domesday Book it was sort of described as a waste because we assumed something to do with the kind of huge amount
offensive. We were offended by that, weren't we?
We were quite shocked, I think. Yeah. And then you've got, within a couple of 100 years, Beeston is land that is being used to graze sheep as part of Kirkstall Abbey and their land endowments. But what happened in the middle of that has a lot to do with this guy called Ilbert de Lacy. And he came across to England, to Britain, with William the Conqueror, and was really sort of significant in the harrying of the north. So he did a great job of harrying Leeds and the areas around here. And as a reward, he was given lands all around, including Pontefract. So he became the Baron of Pontefract, and he took over lands in Leeds as well. So we've got Ilbert de Lacy. His son, Henry de Lacy, gives the land, actually, I think it was his grandson, possibly. There's a lot of de Lacys. But by the time we get to the 1130s, Henry de Lacy, who I think is the second Henry de Lacy by this point, gives the land for Kirkstall Abbey. But the land he gives isn't the land that the Abbey is on.
Right.
And that is something I think lots of people don't realise, because Kirkstall, before it was in Leeds, that Abbey and that company of monks were originally set up in Barnoldswick.
Really?
Yeah, which is kind of on the Lancashire border.
Yeah, was it called Kirkstall? No.
No. So it all comes about because Henry de Lacy basically gets really ill, and he calls the Abbot of Fountains Abbey, which is a Cistercian monastery out near Ripon. He calls the abbot out to him, and he says basically, if God will make me better, I will start a new Cistercian house. And the whole of the kind of rise of Fountains Abbey, because Fountains Abbey by this point, Fountains Abbey is founded in 1132, Kirkstall's founded in 1152. So actually, Fountains Abbey's only been around less than 20 years at this point. But Cistercians are becoming incredibly popular in Yorkshire. And that's because the Benedictines, they're the monks who lived at places like St Mary's Abbey in York. Those guys had got really fat and kind of gluttonous and wealthy, and all of the ideals around being a monk and living humbly. The Benedictines by this point sort of laughing at that, to be honest.
And Cistercians.
And in fact,
what are Cistercians?
So Benedictines are based on the rule of St Benedict. They're kind of the original monks in some ways.
Classic monks.
Certainly, it's the classic monks as they came to be in England to start with. And those Benedictine monks realised they quite liked the money they made from their wool that they were producing, which went at a massive price. Britain at this point is hugely important in rearing sheep, selling wool. People from Flanders and Italy are coming over to buy the wool that's made in Yorkshire. And so the Benedictines get really rich and kind of let themselves go a little bit in religious sense, and in a non-religious sense, to be honest. And the Cistercians are a reaction to that. So they originally the whole idea of the Cistercians originates in France, and it's brought over to England. And St Mary's Abbey is one of the worst of these like gluttonous, terrible monasteries, according to the Cistercians. And the Cistercians believe that they need to get back to sort of the origins of the monastic life. They want to be in the middle of nowhere. They want to be, have no one around them. They want to have to fend for themselves from nature, and they want to dedicate their whole lives to prayer and to living according to these religious rules. They're supposed to be vegetarians, they're supposed to be like super good monks. And originally, there's a bit of a split at St Mary's Abbey in York, where one of the stories is that the Archbishop of York gets involved, who is secular, who has nothing to do with the monastery. And actually, my personal favourite thing to do if you get a chance to go to York is to go up to where the art gallery is. And if you look really closely, you'll see there's a wall coming round here. That's the Abbey Wall. And there's a wall coming round here, and that's the city wall. So when those walls were intact, you've got the Abbey and the city literally competing for space. So you've got this like tension between the secular, which is the Archbishop who answers to the king, and you've got the monastic of the Abbey. And so the Archbishop helps some monks from St Mary's Abbey in York break away. And I think one of the stories is that they kind of take some of the Archbishop's men into the chapter house where no one is allowed to go unless they're a monk. And then there's a massive brawl, and they get into a huge fight, and then these monks are kind of ejected, and the Archbishop of York gives them some land and helps them set up at Fountains, which is near Ripon. And so that's happening in the kind of 1130s. And then by the time we get to Henry de Lacy saying, I want to help you guys, I want to set up a new monastery. So he goes to Fountains, where by this point, they're still having hard times. It took them a long time to build what's at Fountains Abbey now. When those monks were first there, they had really harsh winters, and they had to basically fend for themselves with very little. But 20 years on, they've got buildings, they've got some stuff established, they are established, and they're holding up a different standard to the Benedictines, sat eating loads of meat and drinking loads of wine at St Mary's Abbey in York. So Henry de Lacy takes the prior of Fountains, and he sets up his own monastery, or he helps the Cistercians set up a new monastery in Barnoldswick. So they're really good, right? Super good religious guys. So the first thing they do is decide that the people of Barnoldswick's church, which 4 different villages and sort of are using and have used historically for a very long time, is too close to their new site. And it bothers them because Cistercians are supposed to be in silence and not bothered by people, and the villagers all come together to do feast days and to to do all their religious festivals and things like that, and it's too close to the monastery, so they knock the church down basically.
What?
Yeah, so the new monks under the abbot, he's called Prior Alexander, he becomes the abbot of this kind of splinter cell of monks. First thing they do, knock the local church down. They get into this big legal dispute, the Pope has to get involved. The Pope says it's fine because it's better in the longer run for the locals to lose a church and gain an abbey than it is for them to just have a church. And they do rebuild the church, but it's a bit late because they've basically burned all local bridges.
Wow.
So really nice guys. And then on top of that, they have some really bad winters. So they're in Barnoldswick for like 5 years. They supposedly they were robbed a lot. Yeah. But the interesting thing is no one quite knows who robbed them, I think. But I've been reading some lovely, histories of Kirkstall Abbey from the late 1800s.
Wow.
You should never, ever believe what antiquarians say, by the way. Their grasp on what's going on is often very limited.
Why?
Why should you never believe what the antiquarians say? Because they make half of it up. Like that was history to the kind of Victorians, was part, fascination with interesting things from the past, and part just like creating narratives from very little fact. There are no facts, to be fair. We had that discussion.
Yeah.
Antiquarians are absolute nightmares for just elaborate.
Trump-esque.
Oh, it's incredible. I mean, I think they go beyond that even. This one starts with a whole thing about how people didn't used to appreciate things and how even though they were monks, they didn't get religion right because we're enlightened now.
Oh, nice.
But obviously, so these books suggest that it was the Scots raiding from Scotland that might have been robbing them all the time.
It's not too far away. I mean, wouldn't it be more likely to just be the locals whose church they'd burnt down?
I mean, who knows?
Yeah.
But they didn't have a very good time in Barnoldswick. And so Abbot Alexander, typical. So
Seems
Abbot
like
Alexander.
Seems like a dry cough you have there.
Yeah, actually, I've been licking a lot of sort of handles on doors and things like that recently. But yeah, so Abbot Alexander's out and about on monastic business, and he comes across the Valley of Airedale. And in that valley, he finds a little community of hermits. And the leader of the hermits is called Seleth, I think. And according to Abbot Alexander, this hermit, they're like hermit shepherds that are living on this bit of land. And he obviously eyes it up and thinks this is a great place for a monastery. And then just really helpfully, the head hermit, this shepherd called Seleth, says that he came from the south because God spoke to him and told him he needed to come up north. In fact, it was, I think, a lot of virgins spoke to him and told him to come up north and find the Valley of Airedale, which one day will be, which is also called Kirkstall or something like that. And because he needs to make it ready for the brothers of the Lord or something along those lines. Obviously, it wasn't called Kirkstall before the church, or it seems highly unlikely. So there are some issues with that story, that being one of them. But yeah, Abbot Alexander kind of tells them all that they're not doing a good enough job of guarding their own souls and being religious properly. And then he goes off and asks Henry de Lacy to set him up in Airedale, in what will become Kirkstall.
Right, yeah. And do we know what was going on around what we now know as Kirkstall? I mean, and Burley and...
It was still forest. I mean, if you think about it, this is what Cistercians wanted. They were looking for places that have lots of natural resources. So they've got the Kirkstall River. Yeah. Well, sorry, but the river that goes alongside the Abbey. They've got a massive access to forest, plenty of land to use or to sort of cultivate. And they also have access to Bramley gritstone, which is what the Abbey's built from. So it's really rich in natural resources, and it's really far away from people. Because although there is a settlement in Leeds, it's miles away at this point. Right, supposedly, according to one of the accounts of what the Abbey was like when they moved in, it's not contemporary. So again, you've always got to take it with a pinch of salt. But the valley stretched clearly all the way to Leeds Castle.
And it's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because often, I guess the way that we learn history in British schools is to maybe think of, Britain as, often being reasonably advanced. But you think like Bologna at this point has a university, right? I mean, there are universities around the world, and Leeds is a kind of forest that's... Yeah,
although just because Leeds didn't have a university doesn't mean that, there wasn't stuff happening in other places in Britain.
Yeah.
It's just that Leeds, up till this point, it was a settlement, but it was really an agricultural place. It seems like, anyway. It wasn't the place you go for religious or educational enlightenment. It was the place you went to get
like it is now. Like it is
obviously,
now, right? Yeah.
So they have to. Henry de Lacy has to kind of negotiate with William of Poitou, who owns that specific bit of land, and they have to come to an agreement with the hermits. So some of the hermits join them and become part of the monastery, and some of the hermits take money instead and are paid off to leave them alone. And it's all kind of agreed, and they start building the abbey. At this point, so when they started out in Barnoldswick, there were 12 monks and there were 10 lay brothers. So monastic society and life in a monastery is split up into whether you're a monk or whether you're a lay brother. And if you were a lay brother, you would get kind of severely beaten if you tried to educate yourself, because your job was to do all the jobs. And if you tried to educate yourself, you were committing the sin of envy.
Wow. Labourer, that kind of sounds a bit like labourer, right?
Yeah. I'm not sure whether there's a link between those words or not, but they certainly do sound similar. But having said that, I have a feeling it's probably more to do with the French. That would be my guess.
Yeah.
Nice. But yeah,
so this is the 1150s, right? Right?
So 1152 is when they arrive at Kirkstall and they start to build it. And over the next, few decades, they build the abbey. They keep the land at Barnoldswick as a grange. So monasteries at this point, they are, even though they're Cistercian, people give them things, people give them land, people bequeath things to them. They tend to be very savvy, or they have to be quite savvy to do well, in a very business sense as well, because they are making a fortune off the back of the sheep particularly, but they also have cattle, they have farms, they have breweries, and they're doing all of this on various different bits of land. So there's Kirkstall, and the actual abbey did have, a brewing area and things like that, but they also had granges. So over time, they pick up more and more bits of land, which is how they end up with Beeston and, various places like that. They've got one at Barnoldswick. They've got one at Micklethwaite as well, which causes them a bit of trouble later. So Micklethwaite was a grange that they had that was seized off them by Henry II.
For why?
As well. Because there's a guy called Roger of Mowbray who kind of rose up against Henry II. And so Henry II confiscated all his lands. And that included this grange of Micklethwaite that the abbey was sort of renting off him, and they were really, really annoyed. But at the same time, Henry II gives the abbey permission to exist. So in the 1156, the Pope says, "You're an abbey now. I officially grant you my protection, and you can keep everything you've got." And Henry II does the same sort of thing, but then he gets annoyed at this Roger of Mowbray guy, so he sort of changes his mind about some of it.
What's the impact of Kirkstall Abbey on Leeds, and why does it then have a kind of an important role in the development of Leeds?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, abbeys and monasteries, even though the idea is that they stay really far away and they're really quiet, and this quiet thing is really, really important as well. They're not supposed to be able to hear anyone else's bells. I don't know if you've ever been. So Rievaulx is one of the first Cistercian houses in Yorkshire, which is out towards Helmsley. That's kind of the origins of it in this neck of the woods. And then near Rievaulx, there's an abbey called Byland Abbey, you might have heard of. So there's a new Byland Abbey and there's an old Byland Abbey, because initially they built Byland Abbey too close to Rievaulx and they could each hear each other's bells. And so Byland had to be knocked down and moved further away and rebuilt. So this whole idea of quiet's really important.
Yeah, they're pretty serious about it
then. But then having said that, once you've got an abbey, like a monastery, something like Kirkstall Abbey, there is work that, there's that it builds a community around it really, because it needs a community to survive. They all have guest houses. They have a responsibility to give alms to the poor. So, people who are really poor can go there for food and technically can go there to stay overnight. And the guest houses generally over time get a bit fancier. So there's the bit for the commoners, but there might be rooms for sort of earls or, more important people traveling through. They have a hospital that they build, and that, obviously that's key. People are coming and being cared for in the hospital or not cared for. Bloodletting was their favourite treatment for everything. So, maybe not as good as they thought it was. They also sort of sang at people for various physical reasons.
Great.
Yeah, according to our archaeologist, they had a musical note. So bloodletting was thought to restore balance to the body, to sharpen the senses and clear the brain, and believed to produce a musical voice which would quench sexual desire.
All right. What by having
pretty
your
important,
bloodlet?
I suppose.
By having your bloodlet
And then singing.
Yeah, I've not heard of that, but
No.
yeah. So this is we're getting towards the end of the 12th century then, as this is all starting to develop.
And then it all and after that as well, you know, there's changes happening within the abbey across the next 300 years. The big sort of window at the end of the nave is replaced with a smaller window. There are lots of things happening right just before the dissolution of the monasteries. So the tower was thought to have been added by the second to last abbot in the 1400s, William Marshall, because there's a W and an M sort of scratched into that bit of the tower. So there are various changes happening, you know, all the way through its life as a monastery. And it can be quite hard to tell what, but I'll show you a plan. So this is a sort of floor plan of the monastery. And so as you can see, over the next like 300 years, it really grows. So if you ever go visit now, you've got, let's find the spotlight. So the guest house is sort of over here. Not the guest house, sorry. The entrance where our officers and you know where the shop is, if you go to visit Kirkstall Abbey now, is around here somewhere. So this is the sort of entrance to the big ruined nave of the church. The guest house is actually off this picture over here. And it's really interesting, the archaeology of the guest house, because it shows us some things, you know, that you think might be happening, but it's very hard to track proof of. So I'll show you in a minute, but one of the objects that we found in the guest house is a tuning peg for an instrument. It's just this tiny little peg, but it tells us that people in the guest house were playing instruments.
Yeah.
Which in itself tells us something about how serious or how frivolous or, you know, what was happening. And then here you've got the nave of the monastery, and the big tower here at the end. And then this is what the cloisters, this is where the market happens now. And so here's the chapter house. That's the bit that no one was allowed in. And if you ever go and visit and you go up, you'll notice there's some steps, which tells us it's been extended at some point as well. Above here, you've got the dormitories where the monks would sleep. And then over here, we've got various rooms, including there's a warming house. So the warming house is where there was a big fire, but you were only allowed to stand near it for about 10 minutes or you got kicked out. You know, bearing in mind in the winters, it was absolutely freezing. There were rules about how long you could go near the fire for. You've got the refectory, which is where the monks ate, and you've got this bit which is a kitchen. But then, as you know, I was saying about how things were changing all the time. Yeah. So Cistercians were not supposed to eat meat, but over time, you know, they were pretty rich. They got quite used to certain ways of life. They wanted to eat meat.
They went the way of the Benedictines.
A little bit, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. They had a rule where you were allowed to eat beaver because in Lent, because it counted as a fish.
All right, yeah.
Well, it wasn't meat if it was a beaver, definitely fish. Yeah, and then in the right at the end of the 1400s, just before, in the kind of run up to the dissolution of the monasteries, they actually appealed to the Pope for permission to eat meat. And the Pope said they could eat meat, but only if they built a separate kitchen, thinking that would put them off, but it didn't. So they built a second kitchen just for the meat. So you've got these kind of, it can be quite hard to track down what all of these buildings are. But somewhere here you've got the room that they would, so the little library over here, but the room that they would read in, like the sort of day rooms. You've got the refectory rooms. You've got a couple of different types of sort of kitchens and things over here. And then you have the hospital. And the hospital is still there today. You kind of come out and walk into it, and then it's next to the abbot's house. And the abbot's house was 2 stories, had massive fireplaces in it. It was pretty fancy, considering he lived a life of, you know, monastic sort of piety, abstaining from everything. And a lot of the stone, particularly from the hospital, was kind of taken away and used to build things like Leeds Bridge. So over the kind of hundreds of years since the dissolution of the monasteries, that sort of Bramley gritstone that built Kirkstall has been, a lot of it's been sort of taken away and used on other building projects around the city.
And when was this last in kind of working order then? So obviously, as we see it now, we see it as a kind of ruins. And when was it last? Yeah.
So it was
not
handed
ruins.
over in 1540, I think. Surrendered to the crown in 1540, and at that point, it had an annual sort of income of what was in the late 1800s considered to be about 10 grand a year. So if you think about like Pride and Prejudice and Mr. Darcy having £10,000 a year, the monastery was earning that money.
Yeah.
And this is the tuning peg. So it's just tiny. I think it's made of bone. But it tells us something about the incredible things that were happening that we don't know about, that isn't recorded necessarily.
They were partying, weren't they?
It seems like it, but there are some other suggestions. So there's also evidence that suggests they really did have, they really did start to leave those really early Cistercian belief systems behind, because from the sort of 1300s, the monks got up to some really interesting, not very Christian activities. So
what like?
In 1356, the abbot of Kirkstall was accused of leading a hit squad of 5 monks and a lay brother from the abbey, and some people not from the abbey, to besiege a guy called Thomas Sargent's house at Thorpe, which is near Knaresborough, and they damaged the building, stole his goods, and imprisoned him in Wetherby, apparently.
Why? Why did they do this?
I'm not entirely sure. But you do hear, you get these ideas from various different things about stuff like this going on. In 1366, so 10 years later, the abbot and a lay brother from Kirkstall with 2 widows were said to have attached the Archbishop of York's official. They were trying to stop a widow called Margaret from being summoned to appear before the Archbishop. So you've got this thing about women in the monastery as well. Women are not allowed in the church even. Never mind the kind of other spaces, but there's clearly some stuff going on here with
there's flutes, there's
women. So yeah, you've got loads of different naughty things. In 1377, Abbot John of Thornburg was brought before royal commissioners and charged with numerous offences that he and a certain merchant had allegedly committed, including entering houses and lands in York, attacking servants, destroying trees, and poaching.
This does not sound like the kind of monks that were originally setting up the Kirkstall Abbey.
Yeah, they became very wealthy quite quickly. It seems like they had a few good abbots who were very like business savvy as well. So they became very wealthy, and then it all went completely sort of on its head as well. And it's interesting that a lot of these reports, some of these, they come from the 1300s, partly because more stuff survives from then, I suppose, than from the 1100s. And what survives from the 1100s is often quite doctored. But you've also got this kind of 100 years. The kind of 1200s seem to be missing. And at the beginning of the 1200s, they seem to be quite wealthy. By the time you get Abbot Hugh Grimston, who becomes the abbot in the early 1300s, the abbey's massively in debt. And they owe £5,000, 15 shillings, 7 pence, and 59 sacks of wool. Yeah,
Jeez,
which is massive.
What happened? Yeah.
And we don't really know what happened. But the interesting thing about the wool is that, so Fountains Abbey ended up in a very similar position. Fountains Abbey was bailed out by the Crown a couple of times because they ended up in such massive debt. Because what they would start to do is sell next year's wool. So that, like they'd say, well, look, we've had a bad year this year. We've not got as much wool as we promised you we would have. And actually we need an advance because we want to build some new buildings, and we've not got enough wool here to make the money to build the new buildings. So what we'll do...
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, oh no, what were you going to say?
Oh, we've all been there. We've seen a friend get a car using next year's wool, and you can see that troubles,
Well, that's it. They go, we want to build a tower or something, but we've sold our wool from this year. I tell you what, if you give us the money now, we'll give you the wool next year.
Never sell
and then
next
you have
year's wool.
The sheep catch a plague or something, and you're literally in so much trouble.
So yes, moving towards then. So we so yeah, the War of the Roses. Does this kind of does Kirkstall Abbey kind of interplay with the War of the Roses, or what's going on there?
Not exactly, but you see some of these families sort of appearing again. So like that the guy, I don't know if you remember, we mentioned Roger de Mowbray, who got in trouble with Henry II, had his lands taken off him. The monks at Kirkstall were really annoyed about that. But he pops up in the Leeds kind of Wars of the Roses story. Not him, but his like great granddaughter or something marries into, I think, the Gascoigne family, who were heavily involved in the Wars of the Roses, and who we know quite a bit about because they are the family who had Parlington over in Aberford. That was their big family seat, and who bought Lotherton, which is one of the Leeds Museums and Galleries museums.
Where the peacocks are, right?
And the bird garden. Although it's not a bird garden anymore, it's the wildlife world now. So you have these same sort of families popping up in the same way. You've got Ilbert de Lacy at the harrying of the north, and then his sons are still there hundreds of years later, doing things to do with the abbey. And his kind of descendants pop up with Temple Newsam as well in the sort of early history of Temple Newsam, which we'll come to. But in the same way as that, you've got the Mowbrays, who were kind of still an important family in Leeds, and the important families in Leeds do get involved in the Wars of the Roses because they're all trying to, or holding some sort of royal office. They're part of, they want to appeal to the right side so that they'll help them out in the future and stuff like that. Yeah, and they're very careful with their allegiances as well. So when you get towards the Wars of the Roses, the significant thing for Leeds is 1461, the Battle of Towton. 29th of March 1461, the Battle of Towton was fought just outside of Lotherton and outside of the village of Towton in a snowstorm, apparently, and was supposedly one of maybe the bloodiest battle ever to have been fought. They think about 50,000 people were involved. It was absolute carnage. And that was the really decisive thing that put Richard on the throne.
Wow.
So yeah, you've got the Battle of Towton, but then around this, you've got this family, the Gascoigne family. I mean, you've got lots of other families as well, but we know a little bit more about the Gascoignes because of their connection to the stuff that we have to Lotherton and to Parlington and to objects in the Leeds collection. And so the Gascoignes. This is where we have
the Gascoigne pub and things like that.
There was one of the high schools was called the Gascoigne at one point. I don't know. I don't think it is now. But yeah, they were an incredibly influential family in that side of Leeds. They, in kind of more recent history, owned a lot of the mines around Garforth. Sir Alvery was the last kind of Gascoigne who gave Lotherton to the city of Leeds, and he was ambassador in various places. He was ambassador over in Russia, I think, and then he was ambassador in Japan. He's the first British diplomat that was allowed back into Japan after the bombs were dropped at Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, I mean, this family remains prominent for a very long time, but their origins are really interesting because the first real sort of Gascoigne that we know anything about, we know about because he's in Shakespeare.
Ah, right.
So William I Gascoigne, although I think that his dad was called William, so I don't know why he's William I, but he was the Lord Chief Justice for Henry IV, and he appears in Henry IV Part 2 by Shakespeare. And interestingly, a later Gascoigne is a contemporary of Shakespeare, sort of trying to write poetry and stuff, not doing a very good job of it necessarily. They got everywhere. So you've got William IV, who's kind of, and he was associated with Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV. And so Henry Bolingbroke was exiled. and he remained in court, and he was like the intermediary going between, the king and Henry Bolingbroke, as he was then. And then so Henry then comes back while King Richard is away, and he says he comes back to just sort of reclaim his lands and reclaim the Duchy of Lancaster, but actually he just carries on until he's usurped the throne, and then kind of throws Richard in a dungeon where he mysteriously dies. But the Gascoignes are one of the first families that support Henry Bolingbroke, who becomes Henry IV. And so there's William, and he's got a brother who's around at the same time, and they get promoted up by the king, and that really cements their family's importance in the north, and also kind of, so that's one of the catalysts for the Wars of the Roses. There are some people so one of the other Gascoignes serves a lord who then rebels against Henry IV because he's a usurper. So that's one of the kind of beginning of the big event that splits the nobility and leads to, a few years down the line, the Wars of the Roses. And the Gascoignes are very much, they're in it, they're right there.
In the middle of it, yeah.
In the middle of it, supporting Henry IV and the Duchy of Lancaster. But they're quite clever because the kind of aftermath of this and the Wars of the Roses are happening over the next 2-3 generations. And across those generations, the Gascoignes managed to kind of, initially especially, they seem to sort of hold themselves back. So you've got the next William is a really significant knight. At the actual time of the Battle of Towton and of the Wars of the Roses, he's a very important Yorkshire figure who's quite influential, and he's been a knight, and he's been on all these campaigns, and he's been on the peace commissions that were part of the process, believe it or not. So he kind of stays out of it, and then all of his brothers and brother-in-laws and things like that get involved on different sides. So it almost balances out, because it means when one of them wins, because there's the Neville family won this sort of battle, so they demote this side of the family, but actually they've got some members of the family in their entourage, so they don't do anything too bad to the other side of the family.
Right, yeah.
And when the Percys are doing
this was
well,
purposeful?
I mean, it's hard. It's impossible to know, really, isn't it? It's really interesting because the reality is the gentry they were all tied into allegiances with other families because of the way that the marriages worked and things like that. But it is interesting that it seems like it was purposeful on William. I'm going to have to find which William. There's so many William Gascoignes, you wouldn't believe it. William III, that's the one. So in sort of 1455, when the wars broke out, seems like it was purposeful from his point of view not to get involved in either side. But then his son William IV is fighting alongside Henry Percy, which is the Lancastrian side. So it's quite interesting because it seems like as they go down the generations, they more and more put their eggs in one basket and not the other. Nicholas, who was working for a supporter of the Nevilles, comes across to the Lancastrian side when it sort of suits him. And, over the next couple of generations, they very much get in bed with the Percy family. And Henry Percy dies at the Battle of Towton. And an interesting question is, does William IV die at the Battle of Towton as well? Because we don't know, but the next time he's mentioned, he's dead. And it's only, the next year. And his wife's getting permission to remarry. And his wife is Joan, who is the descendant of the Mowbray people from earlier.
Oh my God. I mean, if you're going to die, you want it to be a key thing in an episode, your death, don't you? I mean, if in EastEnders, they just start up the next and people are just casually talking about how you're now dead. You'd be a bit that's not the swan song that I was looking for.
And it's not just that, because Joan seeks permission to remarry a Yorkist. So she goes to remarry onto the other side of the issue. Yeah. So it's sort of, there seems to be a lot of swapping about. And even to be fair, so the Neville family, who are the big Yorkists, the other really big family in the region, they then usurp, after they've got Richard on the next Richard on the throne, they usurp him because he annoys them. So they try and put Henry IV back on the throne again after that. So they kind of defect. And then a lot of them are killed. A lot of the Nevilles are killed. So the Percys, who were in real trouble because they picked the wrong side and they were all supporters of the Lancastrian side, seem to be kind of reinstated. And the Gascoignes like marry all of them. So, and then are like reinstated at the same sort of time, basically.
Wow. High drama.
I've tried to leave as many sort of numbers out as possible because it gets really confusing, and it really confuses me which ones are which. You know, there's about five William Gascoignes.
I used to have a ruler when I was at school that had all the, you know, that helped. Just realised as well, because we could just chat about this stuff so much, we should probably get on to Temple Newsome and then dive on to so Temple Newsome is obviously sorry, go on.
Oh no, so Temple Newsome, we go back to the de Lacys again, which is great. So because in the Domesday Book, Temple Newsome, the land that Temple Newsome is on, belongs to Ilbert de Lacy, the family who also owned Barn Oldswick, and I think Ilbert's like the great granddad or the granddad of Henry Percy, who gives Kirkstall its initial land and then negotiates the next lot of land. Also, actually, the land he initially gives Kirkstall in Barn Oldswick doesn't belong to him. He's like renting it off some other guy, and then he hasn't been paying his rent. So after a while, they get like it's taken off the monks because he couldn't have given it to them in the first place. And Henry II has to kind of intervene. And I think in the end, he says to the guy that owned it in the first place, like, yeah, but you've done a lot of sins, so you should give it, you know, rent it to the monks instead.
Wow.
So he's a bit of a shadier character, Henry de Lacy, than he seems. But he's certainly got an interest in religious orders and giving stuff away, because so after doing all this stuff with Kirkstall Abbey in the 1150s, in about 1155, so only 3 years after they sort of actually settle in Leeds, he gives Temple Newsome to the Knights Templar. So he's just giving stuff out left, right, and centre to religious people, which reminds me, I've got a great object here that, where is it? That I wonder if people will recognise. So this is a Knights Templar stone, and they are all over various buildings in Leeds.
Wow.
So this double cross is the symbol of the Knights Templar. Sometimes it's sort of flared at the ends.
Yeah. It does look familiar.
And so because of the way buildings were taxed, like, you know, you were taxed on the building, but if you had one of these stones, because the Knights Templars did not have to pay tax to the crown. So they put these stones on their buildings to show when sort of the sheriff or, you know, the tax collector came around that they didn't have to pay tax. And then people in Leeds were like, that's a great idea. So even now, there are loads of these stones dotted about on, you know, like pubs and stuff like that. Because they thought, well, if we pop one on the building, you know.
Yeah, a bit like kind of bricking up your windows to pay a bit less tax on number of windows.
On light. Yeah, exactly. So the Knights Templar are given this bit of land that is Temple Newsome by Henry de Lacy, who then sort of goes on, he dies in 1177, and they build what's called a preceptory. They build some buildings, they have a fund. In 1307, decides he doesn't like Knights Templars anymore. So he basically, sorry guys, confiscates it. The Templars are thrown out. And at that point, he gives it to one family, and then it passes to a different family. And then the Templars sort of 20 years later try and get it back and say, actually, we want it, you know, we should have it, but they're not allowed it back. And it ends up in the hands of, in 1537, Thomas Darcy, so Lord Darcy, And it's been in the Darcy family by this point for a while, but there's not really anything on it. And it's Thomas Darcy that builds the Tudor House, you know, as it very much still stands today. It's incredible. We always say this is the biggest council house in Britain. So Thomas Darcy, he builds this he inherits it, and he's 21, and he inherits it in sort of 1518 or 19, and he builds this. No, I'm wrong. He inherits it, so he builds it between 1500 and 1520. So he must inherit it, you know, in 1498 or something like that. And he's 21, and he's just like, I'll build a nice giant house here.
Amazing.
And that's, you know, it's great. But he's really not a fan of Henry VIII dissolving the monasteries. So, you know, it's interesting because, again, you come back to the sort of de Lacy. This is the land that de Lacy owned and gave to the Templars. Kirkstall's the land that de Lacy owned and gave to the Cistercians. And here we are, you know, hundreds of years later, and Lord Darcy, who lives in Temple Newsome, is part of the uprising against the dissolution of the monasteries. And so there's a really big, there's a Lancaster, I think it's Lancastrian, or there's a kind of smaller rebellion, but then there's the Pilgrimage of Grace, as it's called. So that is Yorkshire noblemen who really don't agree with the dissolution of monasteries, who actually rise up against Henry VIII. And so because of the kind of connection between the guy in Temple Newsome and what's happening in Kirkstall Abbey, I suppose, basically he gets executed by Henry VIII. Not having it.
Not having it.
But before that, he was a really important figure because, you know, under Henry VII, this Thomas de Lacy's really like doing a lot of ruling in the country. You know, he's based at Pontefract Castle. He fights against Spain and Scotland under Henry VII. He's, you know, really significant in the kind of court of Henry VII. But yeah, Henry VIII doesn't acknowledge or doesn't accept this kind of pilgrimage of grace and this idea that they want to keep the monasteries, so off with his head and all that.
It's interesting, this kind of recurring relationship, I guess, between power and I don't know, the church and the transcendent, and yeah, that's interesting.
And all these different families in Leeds specifically as well. You know, you think, you know, the government's in Westminster, the palaces are all down south, or maybe Balmoral, or, you know, wherever the big royal seats are. But you don't really think about Leeds as a place that is like legitimately kind of hugely important to the twists and turns of our whole nation's history. But, you know, even in this period, and I know we're only covering about 500 years, but you've got Towton at the, you know, you've got things like, you've got the Cistercians, which are a hugely important part of medieval, you know, sort of medieval post-conquest history, and they're happening in the north, like more so than kind of the rest of the country. You've got Towton, you've got the Gascoignes being involved in all these different things, and actually there was a Gascoigne at the court of Henry VIII, who was involved with Cardinal Wolsey. You've got kind of all these Leeds families, and then you've got, you know, places like Temple Newsome, which is, you know, the owner's beheaded because of being, you know, going from being a significant figure in British politics to being like an anti-figure. And then what happens next at Temple is that you have the next family who move in are Henry VIII's niece and her husband, who was the Earl, who was he the Earl of? Somewhere in Ireland, begins with an L. That's not helpful. But while I'm trying to remember that, I'll show you this, because this is a really cool thing. And this is at Temple Newsome now. So you can go see this in what we call the Breton Room. So this is one of the rooms.
Really nice duvet cover.
Yeah, I don't think the duvet cover is Tudor, to be fair. Oh. But the bed is.
Yeah.
And this came into the Leeds collections from a house, I think in Wakefield, Breton. So we call it the Breton Bed. And supposedly this was made for Henry VIII to stay in. Nice. And in a very similar way to maybe some of our politicians these days, who knows? But they've got these incredible carvings to really impress him. They really want to impress him. And so they've carved like significant male, like gallant, heroic figures. So there's like St. George, and there's David and Goliath, you know, scenes of like strong men, so that if, assuming this is for Henry VIII, so that he would feel really like, yeah, look, I'm one of these guys.
Like if we had a prime minister that considered themselves Churchillian, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Possibly. Yeah. If you carved a Churchill bed, maybe.
I think we should start to wrap up soon and get on some questions for you, I'm sure. But is there anything else before we move on to that?
I mean,
or should we just throw it to questions?
There's the horrific murder of Mary, Queen of Scots' husband, who lived at Temple Newsome. So maybe we should cover that first.
Yeah.
Go move on to questions. So this is the last thing about Temple Newsome. So you've got Henry VIII. He hands it over to his niece. His niece's son is Henry Stuart. Henry, Lord Darnley of Temple Newsome, who marries Mary, Queen of Scots. He is her second husband. He is the father of James I. And here he is in all his glory, looking great. And these portraits, all of these amazing Tudor portraits, are in the Leeds collections and on display, most of them at Temple. So there you've got Henry and his little brother.
Great picture.
And here's the portrait we've got in Leeds of Mary, Queen of Scots, which I always think is quite interesting because she looks very different to some of the other portraits of her that you see. But so Lord Darnley marries Mary, Queen of Scots. And actually, it's a massive scandal because Elizabeth I is really angry at his mum for it was sort of arranged in secret. You know, he's related to the throne. He is the grandson of Henry VII. So it's quite a big deal. And she sneakily marries him to Mary, Queen of Scots. And at that point, Elizabeth I confiscates Temple Newsome back. But it's okay because they hadn't been married very long when Mary is pregnant and Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, is brutally murdered in Scotland. So there's like, and it's a massive mystery. No one knows who did it. Like Mary was in she was a suspect. All these other people in their kind of group were suspect. There's an explosion in the house he was staying at, and there's evidence that there was a rope, but someone must have given him a heads up that this was happening. It was obviously planned because he was actually found outside where he'd been escaping with his servant and was stabbed to death.
Oh my God.
It's mad, isn't it?
It's really mad. Yeah.
And then his brother, who we saw in that other picture, his brother ends up. So there's a portrait.
That's half the size of him.
Yeah, the one that's half the size of him. But to be fair, the one that's half the size of him is a child at that point.
Okay.
But so this is Arabella, and we'll leave you with Arabella because she is the daughter of his brother. So Lord Darnley, he's killed, and his brother has this daughter called Arabella. So she's the cousin of James, who becomes James I of England, James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. And so she's got the same claim to the throne that he has.
And what year is this?
So this picture's taken in the sort of, when was it So 1610 she gets married. So this must have been about 10 years before that.
Right, yeah.
Maybe 15 years before that. So right at the end of the 1500s. And she's such a commodity because of how closely related. And for a while, the people that, before they put James on the throne, they sort of flirted with the idea that maybe she should take over the throne. But then they put James on the throne instead. And they're like trying to find a good match because she's so close to the throne, that what they kind of think, what do we do with her? So her whole life, they're trying to arrange this marriage, and then she gets caught trying to arrange a marriage herself, and she says, no, I'd never get married without your permission, Elizabeth I, and then marries this guy shortly after Elizabeth dies. So the guy she marries is William Seymour, who is related to Lady Jane Grey, who was the queen that was put on the throne before Mary chucked her off and killed her. You know, so they're all in this kind of, and he's part of the royal line, and she's part of the royal line, and it's seen as
viper's nest. It's viper's nest.
Yeah, and she marries him in secret, and it's seen as an attempt to usurp the throne. So he's locked up in the Tower of London. She is like put under house arrest in Lambeth, and then she escapes by dressing as a man, and she's supposed to meet him. They've been like sending letters, hundreds of letters she wrote survive, and he's supposed to escape and meet her in Lee by the sea to get on a boat to France, but he doesn't get there in time. So she gets on the boat, and James I captures her on the boat really near Calais. So she nearly gets away, but instead he's executed. She's locked in the Tower of London, where she dies shortly afterwards from a mixture of illness and starving herself. And this portrait of her is in Temple Newsam. And I think it's just like such an amazing connection and such an amazing story. And, you know, she's only in her 30s when she dies. And this is sort of all we have of her. And then there's all these letters that exist.
Well, we should take a pause there and we'll be straight over on Zoom now for people to ask questions or just to have a chat really about history in Leeds. And then the next chat, we're going to talk about then the Victorians and kind of industrial Leeds and towards, I guess, towards contemporary Leeds.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's so much that, you know, this is just starting to be the point. There's all sorts of Elizabethan figures we haven't had a chance to cover from Leeds, like Frobisher the pirate, who, you know, discovers some of the kind of top of Canada and brings some Inuits back. And, you know, Arabella Bird, the female Victorian explorer that no one ever talks about. So hopefully we can start to bring some of those stories into it as well.
Sounds great.
Like Leeds to the world.
Yeah.
Not necessarily always in the most positive of ways, but certainly worth kind of finding out.
There's a lot going on. Okay, we'll see everybody on Zoom in a second then. Great. Look forward to it. Thanks a lot, Emily.